There was a time before cable, when the local anchorman reigned supreme, when people believed everything they heard on TV. This was an age when only men were allowed to read the news, and in San Diego, one anchorman was more man than the rest. His name was Ron Burgundy. He was like a god walking amongst mere mortals. He had a voice that could make a wolverine purr, and suits so fine they made Sinatra look like a hobo. In other words, Ron Burgundy was the ball.
This is Octic News with 5-time Emmy Award-winning anchor.
We ask why atoms form chemical bonds, and the true answer is in order to become more stable. This is because of the octet rule, which states that atoms will bond in order to have 8 electrons in their valence shell, like a noble gas.
Today's matchup, we have ionic versus covalent bonds. Ionic bonds occur when there's a complete transfer of valence electrons from one atom to another, while covalent bonds occur when electrons are shared between atoms. Generally, ionic bonds are metal bonding with nonmetals because the metal in the bond loses its electrons, forming a cation, and the nonmetal gains electrons, forming an anion. Covalent bonds usually occur between two nonmetals, and sometimes metalloids. Because atoms have different affinity for electrons, the electrons that are shared sometimes spend more time around one certain atom than the other.
To be more specific, there are actually 2 types of covalent bonds. Daniel Craig and Sean Connery. Just kidding, I'm just joshing ya. There are polar and nonpolar bonds. Polar bonds have a difference in electronegativity between the 2 atoms sharing the electrons that is greater than 0 and less than 2. In this case, the electrons are shared unequally. And nonpolar have atoms that have equal electronegativities. In this case, the electrons are shared equally.
Today's matchup, we have ionic versus covalent bonds. Ionic bonds occur when there's a complete transfer of valence electrons from one atom to another, while covalent bonds occur when electrons are shared between atoms. Generally, ionic bonds are metal bonding with nonmetals because the metal in the bond loses its electron, forming a cation, and the nonmetal gains electrons, forming an anion. Covalent bonds usually occur between 2 nonmetals, and sometimes metalloids. Because atoms have different affinity for electrons, the electrons that are shared sometimes spend more time around one certain atom than the other.
Here we are in San Diego, California, and the weather is almost as nice as Sex Panther cologne. Made of bits of real panther and illegal in 9 countries. 60% of the time, it works every time. Currently, we're in the middle of a crazy conflict right now between sodium and chlorine. Right now, sodium is giving the valence electron to chlorine, creating 2 ions and attracting each other and bonding. On their own, they are very dangerous, but when combined, they form a useful compound, sodium chloride, which is also known as table salt.
Yeah, but how do you come up with the name sodium chloride? I'm a genius, but I missed that lesson on naming because I was watching Jeopardy last night with my dad.
You take the cation, then add the anion, and add ide. There you go, sodium chloride.
How do you know if something is an ionic bond?
Well, it takes place between a metal and a nonmetal. Also, if you subtract the electronegativity values, if the difference is above 1.7, the bond is ionic.
But don't some bonds have multiple oxidation states?
If that's the case, add Roman numerals in parentheses after the element.
What are some examples of ionic bonds?
Name a few. NaCl, or sodium chloride, is a great example, although he's a bit salty. A few more are potassium bromide or sodium bromide. These dudes are dumb funny because they're mad OD crystalline.
There's another brawl in the street. It's a polar covalent bond, yo. OMG, it's just connected and made a dihydrogen oxide with 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. Yeah, it's just weird, yo.
Okay, Brian, stay calm. Just tell me what's going on.
Alright, word. So the hydrogens are sharing their electrons with the oxygen, but not evenly. That's buns. This is because the oxygen has larger affinity for electrons, just like the girls with me when I use Sex Panther. 60% of the time, it works every time.
Tomorrow is a crazy day in sports. There are many nonpolar covalent bonds happening, such as carbon and H4, C5 and H12, and I2.
Wait, what the frick is the difference between polar and nonpolar covalent bonds?
In a polar covalent bond, the electrons are shared unevenly, whereas in a nonpolar bond, they are shared evenly.
Yo, what are some non-polar covalent bonds?
I don't know.
There's methane gas, pentane, and iodine in a diatomic state.
I love methane gas. It's an important ingredient in cow farts. LMAO.
So, it is very explosive and is a greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change.
Hey Ron, when I was in high school in chemistry class, we learned about molecules and formula units, but I can't remember exactly what makes them different.
Molecule unit is composed of two more elements that are covalently bonded. It is the smallest particle of that substance that has all of the properties of that substance. Also, it's the smallest particle of that substance that can participate in a chemical reaction. Cool.
Days in school, I remember some days where we learned about formula units. Formula units indicates the lowest whole number ratio of ions in an ionic compound. It is positively and negatively charged ions in an ionic compound are arranged in crystal lattice, and there is no discrete particle comparable to a molecule.
Now, team, let's go over the differences in ionic, polar covalent, and nonpolar covalent bonds.
Ionic is the attraction between oppositely charged ions. Polar covalent forms by unequal sharing of electrons, and nonpolar covalent bonds forms by equal sharing of electrons.
Facts!
Ionic bonds have positive or negative charges. Polar covalent has slightly positive or negative bonds, and nonpolar covalent have no charge.
So we're back to the news station in San Diego. A great example of ionic bonding is shown in NaCl or sodium chloride. A fantastic example of polar covalent is an H2O molecule, and a wonderful nonpolar covalent example is an O2 molecule or oxygen.
Great job, team. Way to keep the great city of San Diego informed. Stupid.